stop a second and say how incredible it is. All these people in the last administration saying, oh no, we need legislation. We can't solve this migrant problem, blah, blah. Donald Trump came in. I think illegal border crossings to our southern border are down 99.99% in the first couple of months, which just underscores this is all about the incentive structure you put in place. People are not going to risk their lives and their fortunes to undertake this dangerous journey to come into our country illegally if they don't think they're going to be allowed in if they get to the border and allowed to stay here if they are allowed in, right? And so if we send the wrong messages and we create the wrong incentives, we're just it's creating our own problem. As soon as those incentives are gone, the problem almost vanishes by itself. I mean, frankly, our bigger problem now is how to repatriate the millions of people that were let in illegally during the last administration.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I am the CEO of American Moment, and I'm very glad to be back with you this week. You might notice this set is a little different. We have decided to visit the Department of State, specifically to visit Deputy Secretary Chris Landau. We had a very fun conversation, but before I get to that, always got to flag the website at americanmoment.org. We've got a whole host of programs that we're going to be putting on this summer, this fall. We have the Fellowship for American Statecraft, where we literally pay you to help you find your first job. We have applications open for that for the fall right now, so you should make sure to go check that out. And then if you're currently an intern or you're planning on being an intern in DC this fall, we always have the page for AM Fridays up. That is basically, we buy like $5,000 worth of Chick-fil-A a week, bring in a bunch of cool speakers over in the Senate, to give you a real, grounded education on the issues most animating public life right now. So make sure to join us for that. It's always a lot of fun. It's usually the highlight of my week, and the speakers are top notch. Would love to have you there. So today, like I said, we're joined by Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau, truly one of the most interesting men in the world. He served as ambassador to Mexico in Trump term 1. He also, once upon a time, clerked for Clarence Thomas. He's done like everything interesting in the world. He was once considered for a judgeship before accepting his job as ambassador to Mexico, and now serves as Deputy Secretary of State. I met him on the transition team down in Palm Beach. We hit it off right away. An extremely fascinating guy. We're super grateful to him and his team for hosting us over here at the State Department. So without further ado, we will go now to Chris Landau. Deputy Secretary, thanks so much for coming on the Moment of Truth podcast.
It's my pleasure, Nick. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you, by the way, for having us in this beautiful room. You were just showing us all the amazing furniture back there.
We're proud to show off these diplomatic reception rooms. I mean, they have some of the real heritage of our country in terms of, I was just showing you the desk on which Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the original copy of the Treaty of Paris that guaranteed our country's independence. So it's a great source of pride to us here in the State Department to be the repository for some of these artifacts. In fact, the Great Seal of the United States, the actual official seal that goes on documents like my commission, the commissions of Supreme Court justices, all other federal officials, is also downstairs, and it actually works. I got a demonstration. So wow. There's some cool aspects of this department that I was not aware of when I came in here.
Yeah, I might have to find that on my way out.
Check it out.
Yeah, well, let's start, as we always do on this podcast, with your background. You have a complicated story. How did you end up as Deputy Secretary of State?
Well, if you take it from the beginning, I was born into a foreign service family. My father was a career foreign service officer, and so I was born in Spain when he was working at the U.S. Embassy over there in Madrid in the early 1960s. And then we lived in Canada for a year, and we left Madrid when I was about 2, so I don't really remember it from that time. And then lived in Canada for a year. When we came to Washington for 6 years when I was a boy. And then my dad was named ambassador to Paraguay in 1972 during the Nixon administration and stayed there for 5 years until the Carter administration. Then he became ambassador to Chile And that's pretty typical for career people that they serve under presidents of both parties. At least in those days, it was easier, I think, to keep your politics and your job separate than I think it is nowadays, given our politicized and more polarized society. He was ambassador to Chile for 5 years under Carter, and then Reagan for a year, and then Reagan sent him as ambassador to Venezuela. So the whole time I was growing up, from the time I was 8 to 21, my parents were living in South America. And I went to high school then back in the States and college. Always thought I wanted to follow my dad's footsteps into the Foreign Service, was very interested in international affairs. But he actually pulled me aside when I was a senior in college. I was thinking of taking the Foreign Service exam and said, get a professional degree. It will always hold you in good stead. You can still do government service, but you don't want to be a hostage to the bureaucracy. And so I thought that sounded like a good idea. Went to law school and wound up practicing law for some 30 years. And then was fortunately, thanks to President Trump, given the opportunity to bring my life full circle back to my diplomatic roots. And I served as U.S. ambassador to Mexico. And I think we'll talk about that in a sec. But for me, that was kind of a homecoming to where I kind of started my life. And it's been a wonderful journey. I feel very, very blessed to have the chance to be sitting here today as Deputy Secretary of State.
Yeah. So speaking of like following in your father's footsteps, he had a very storied career as a diplomat as well, right? Like tell us more about, the sorts of things that he was involved in and how well he did as a diplomat representing America in South America.
Well, thanks for asking that. I mean, my father really had a very interesting and kind of different life. He was born into a Jewish family in Austria. I didn't even know this until I was in college. I knew he was born in Austria. I didn't realize his background. I knew he fled when Hitler came in 1938 from Austria. And at that point, the United States had a very limited policy to be taking in people from who were fleeing the Nazi regime, which had taken over his country. He made his way to Colombia, South America. But his goal was always to get to the United States. And so he got his parents out of Austria. And then he got a job with the Otis Elevator Company in Colombia, and they transferred him to their office in New York. So he finally reached his goal of getting into the United States in the summer of 1941. I was working for Otis Elevator when Pearl Harbor happened in December of that year, and was then told that he was going to be fired as an enemy alien. And thought that was very unfair, and made his way down on a train to the Justice Department here in Washington on Christmas Eve of 1941, presented a letter to the Attorney General saying, I think it's unfair that I'm going to get fired as an enemy alien when I fled the Nazi regime that took over Austria.
Could you just do that when you were like an employee at an elevator company?
Well,
like just show up
yes.
to DOJ?
I mean, well, this is, in a sense, I tell the story in some detail because I think it's actually kind of a reflection of how our society has gotten overwhelmed with bureaucracy and government. I mean, it seems almost laughable to think that on Christmas Eve that anybody could just show up unannounced without an appointment to the Justice Department, walked in with a letter, and he walked out on Christmas Eve with a letter from the Department of Justice. I still have these letters. I have his letter, and I have the letter he received saying he should not be fired from his job. That would be inappropriate and unfair. That was not the policy of the administration. And so he kept his job. But then, as things happened, he quit to join the army because he felt he owed an obligation to our country, and became a citizen on a fast track in 1943, and went to officer candidate school, became an officer in the army, was very useful as a native German speaker, went over to Europe after the war. Actually, he then wanted to join the U.S. Foreign Service after the war because he was always interested in diplomacy. He took the exam at the embassy in Vienna in 1946, and the good news was he passed. The bad news is he hadn't been a citizen long enough to actually qualify for the Foreign Service. So he couldn't join, and then went into private business, promoting or working with U.S. exports to and from Latin America, given his connection to Colombia. And then, lo and behold, the Eisenhower administration in the late 50s had a program where they were trying to bring people into the State Department who had commercial experience at kind of a level commensurate with that experience. So he came in 1957 as commercial attaché in Montevideo, Uruguay. It's his first job in the Foreign Service. And then, because he came in at that already pretty high level, within 15 years, he became a U.S. ambassador himself. So I'm super proud of my dad. I mean, I just think he's one of those people that, he never really went to college because he was always, he wound up getting a college degree at night school here at GW, and he was just before he became an ambassador. And, I just think it's like such a great American story that makes me super proud. He was always a very proud American. He came from that generation of real assimilationists who did not even teach me German at home. I mean, it never occurred to me that, he had any ties to the home country. He became Catholic in Colombia, converted. And so, I was, from the time I was a little boy, we went to Catholic Mass every Sunday. And, it was just somebody who really kind of turned the page on his life in the old country and really embraced, and in turn was embraced by this country. And I think it's one of the reasons that he felt a lot of pride in public service, and one of the reasons that I'm so honored to have the chance to follow in his footsteps in public service.
Well, I'm very glad to talk about that. We are recording this the day after Father's Day, so I figured.
Sorry, I apologize. That was longer than you probably wanted, but
no, that's wonderful.
I think it gives some context, because my story and my family story is kind of different than a lot of Americans. We all kind of get here by different paths, and I think it's really interesting when I meet people whose life differs very, dramatically from mine, and I find we have a lot of common political beliefs, but our life stories are totally different. I remember feeling that way when I met Justice Thomas, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I mean, he grew up in completely different circumstances than I did, and yet we have so much in common in terms of just the way we think about this country and our history.
Yeah, so that was something I was going to ask you about. You clerked for Justice Thomas, right?
I did. I was very blessed that after law school, I clerked for both Justice Thomas for a year, Justice Scalia for a year on the Supreme Court, and then Justice Thomas. And that is an incredible blessing for any lawyer to have the opportunity to practice or to work with such great figures in American law, to work at the Supreme Court. And, I think that really changed my life in a lot of ways. I mean, to work so closely with two real giants of our legal system who are, were different in a lot of their ways personally, but again, had very similar perspectives on the role of a judge in our federal system, and not just implementing their own policy preferences, but reading very carefully the words of the law and looking at the history to make sure that they were applying these provisions the way they were supposed to be meant. Kind of a modesty towards the law, and frankly, one of the things that has motivated me in coming into the foreign affairs field is that I don't think we've had thinkers like Justice Scalia, like Justice Thomas, in the foreign affairs space for a long time, who are bringing us back to first principles, who are asking us, why is our country all of a sudden involved all over the world? Why are we fighting all these wars everywhere? And I think, the legal system, by the 1980s, when they came on the scene, had drifted very far from its moorings. And, my view is that the foreign policy system also had drifted very far from its traditional moorings. And I'm certainly hoping that in my small way here, I can kind of play a role in this field akin to what they did in that field.
Yeah, that's wonderful. They both seem like wonderful men. I've never met Justice Thomas, but he seems like a delight to work for. Just generally super cheerful guy.
Totally. They both were, again, wonderful role models. It's great for every young person to see somebody that they really look up to early in their career and really respect. And, I think in all of us in life, especially when you're young, you're kind of deciding who you are as a person. And I think it's wonderful to see people. I often think we kind of pick up little things along the way and incorporate them into maybe what we want to become. And then we try to become. And I've certainly learned from people that I admire and tried to emulate their best traits.
Yeah. Well, you served in Trump term 1 as ambassador to Mexico. What did you view your role as in executing the president's foreign policy agenda while you were there?
That was a great honor for me. Again, just to take a step back. So I practiced law for 30 years, and it was a little bit of a turn in my career because I was on a path, and the president actually offered me a judgeship And I think he was very surprised when I said I'd rather be your ambassador to Mexico. And
oh, really? That's how that happened?
Yeah. I mean, I had talked to some people. The post in Mexico was vacant at this time, but again, I don't think most people at that point would have thought of me as somebody, for a foreign policy job, because my whole career had been in the law. People didn't necessarily know that I was very interested in foreign policy. Again, having grown up in Latin America, I went to school in Paraguay for 5 years. I'm bilingual in Spanish, and so I knew I had that and felt like I had something to bring to the U.S.-Mexico relationship that really nobody else could bring for President Trump. I didn't think, given my unique background and my real appreciation for what he was trying to do with the U.S.-Mexico relationship, which was really, focus on migration issues, in particular, our border that had not really been the subject of much interest from our foreign policy establishment for a long time.
Right.
And, I didn't think that given his kind of unconventional approach to Mexico, as well as foreign policy more generally, President Trump would be well served by a career person in that very critical role, which is one of the reasons that I just thought it would be a perfect fit where I could really make a difference. And, I think it turned out that way. I like to think it turned out that way.
Yeah.
I think, again, it was a little bit strange in a sense because my father had been a career Foreign Service officer, and traditionally there's a great deal of distrust and suspicion between the career people here in the State Department and the political people. And it's kind of like I was born a Hatfield and I came back as a McCoy, I guess. But I have great respect and appreciation for what the career people bring to the table, like my own father. But I also think that, particularly for a sensitive post like Mexico, it makes sense to have somebody who actually, has a direct channel into the White House and, can kind of break with bureaucratic common assumptions maybe that haven't been reevaluated for a long time in a way that as a political appointee you can do. I think when you're a career person and you've kind of grown up in the system, you're part of the system, you're going to be back in the system. It's just much harder to, I think, go out on a limb in any particular administration, especially now that our foreign policy has become, I'd say, more partisan than it was during the Cold War.
Right. Yeah, the president made it very clear on the campaign trail that he wanted to sort of realign the priorities of the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. How was that received when you showed up? What did they think about that?
Actually, I have to say, I think it was received much better than expected. I think Americans were expecting a big blow up between President Trump and the Mexican president at that time, President López Obrador, who was, is a kind of an icon of the Mexican left. I think people were expecting a real train wreck in the relationship, but that didn't happen. And I think in a sense, we did what diplomats are supposed to do, which is find common ground where you can say, look, this is our view, these are our interests, and the other side says the same for their point of view, and then you try to find where they overlap and identify common interests to kind of, accentuate the positive and focus on that. Obviously, you have some issues to, where you may disagree, but I think, you always try to look first, where's the low-hanging fruit? And I think, the Mexicans recognize that, their economy and a lot of, what they're trying to do in their country depends on having a good relationship with the United States. We have a lot of leverage over Mexico. And I think it's in everybody's interest for the two countries to try to get along. And I think the one thing that I saw was that President Trump and President López Obrador had some commonality in the sense that they were both political outsiders, who came from outside a traditional two-party establishment that kind of would alternate. I mean, President Trump, in a sense, engineered a hostile takeover of the Republican Party in 2016. He was not the establishment candidate, to say the least. And President López Obrador, differed just by creating his own party. He created a new party in Mexico that's now the majority party, but didn't even exist down there 10 years ago. It was kind of his vehicle. And I think they both appreciated, or they both understood, that in each country, there were kind of big bureaucracies that didn't necessarily embrace them, to say the least. And so, they found common ground and actually got along pretty well. And I think both of them kind of got a kick out of the fact that they got along pretty well, despite what everybody would have assumed. I think that kind of played to both of their instincts, that we're not business as usual people, and everybody would think we're going to, be at each other's throats, but we're not. And, you kind of realize we have more to get out of cooperating than fighting with each other.
I don't remember any of that reporting about them getting along back in term one.
Go figure. I mean, but, they did. It might have gotten bigger play in Mexico, but, I think the media narrative was, to some extent, terrible relationship, blah, blah. And actually, I remember, I was ambassador when the election of 2020, and then, then President-elect Biden kind of called President López Obrador, who again had established a good relationship with President Trump. In fact, his first visit abroad as president of Mexico was to the White House to see President Trump. And this was during the height of the pandemic, mind you. And, I was given a copy of I guess I was told about this conversation between these two leaders when Biden, was elected, and Biden kind of started with a crack, well, at least I'm not Donald Trump. And then I think he thought it was going to be funny. And I think there was dead silence on the Mexican side because they actually got along well with Donald Trump. But I think there was just an assumption of a lot of people on the American left that everybody hates Donald Trump around the world. But, I think as we're seeing now, a lot of countries realize that Donald Trump was somebody they could do business with. And, he wants to make his country great. And President López Obrador wants to make Mexico great. I think President Trump recognizes or defends the sovereignty of our country, but he expects other countries to defend their sovereignty too. And he expects another president to want to make his or her country great again. So that's not a surprise to him. And again, that's kind of the mutual respect that I think is, that makes relationships work. I think, frankly, for the Mexicans, President Trump wasn't asking them to be, trying to do all these things in their country the way we do it here. I think, that in a lot of ways, he was like, look, I respect your sovereignty in your country. And so that was kind of a breath of fresh air for a lot of people who are used to the U.S. being kind of a nanny state around the world and going around scolding and lecturing other countries on how they should do their business.
Yeah. I think the big thing that a lot of people are concerned about as it relates to the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico is obviously immigration, as well as the drug trade, violence coming across the border. Where do you think our relationship is headed, at the very least in this administration, or where you'd like it to get beyond that?
I think one of the things, going to the first part of your question, migration, one of the great contributions of President Trump to American public life has been to focus the attention of our government on the very serious migration issues that have been taking place at our southern border for a long time. This was a priority in the first term and is again now. Politicians of both parties had been kind of dancing around that issue for a long time. And I think, people in the Republican Party were scared about, what this would mean for the Hispanic vote in our country. And I think President Trump said, look, this is what I believe. I think this is the right thing for our country. And I think, lo and behold, he actually did very well in Hispanic communities because I think, people here everybody kind of believes, you shouldn't have open borders, and it's not nobody's interest to have vast, uncontrolled flows of people coming across our border, in violation of our laws. I mean, who is that benefiting? It's certainly not benefiting our country, except for the people who want to use, cheap illegal labor and exploit them really and get around our laws. Again, I think the real question is, what should the appropriate level of legal migration be? And, that's in a democratic society we can differ. You would have hoped that we would all agree that illegal immigration by definition is in nobody's interest, but nobody was really serious about enforcing the border until President Trump came along. I think, the Mexicans understand this and respect that, and we were able to work very well with them. One of the phenomena that's really happening now is that, migration from Mexico is has been declining over the years as a proportion of migration over the southern border. In other words, you're not just, it used to be really just primarily a US-Mexico issue. I think now you're seeing people from all over the world showing up at our southern border, from China, from Bangladesh, from Congo, from Ukraine. And, that's not in the Mexicans' interest either to be having, to be a doormat for people to enter the US illegally.
Right.
So, again, I think there's a lot of areas where we can cooperate with Mexico to control these migratory flows. And, on security, a similar story where, we both should have an interest in combating, the drug trafficking and these cartels, the organized crime. I mean, frankly, it's a much worse problem in Mexico in terms of, the violence, the deaths, what they control. We are, working with them. We both have to work. I mean, we have to make sure that we are doing things in our country to crack down on the flow of drugs from, within our country, the flow of weapons and money to the Mexican cartels. They've got to crack down on the cartels themselves. And, we got to hopefully work together, because it's not in either country's interest to, let these power of these criminal gangs increase. So, I think there is a lot of common ground there. But, these cartels are very dangerous organizations, and this is a very, very big business.
Yeah.
So, again, I think we are dedicated to really, not just talking about this problem, but actually stopping it. I think, as the drug problem has become a lot worse in recent years as we've moved away from organic substances like, cocaine, heroin, that all come from plants that have to be grown out in the open. Now there's a lot of synthetic chemicals, fentanyl and all these synthetic opioids that you can basically make in a basement. It's a lot more challenging, and you can make them as potent as you want. So, basically the amount of fentanyl, it's the equivalent of a grain of salt, can kill an adult, human being. And so we're talking about, infinitesimal amounts that can be, devastating. So we have to, as the challenge has evolved, we have to have our drug strategies evolve. And, that is something that's very near and dear to my heart, to work on really stopping the flow of fentanyl and precursor chemicals into Mexico and then into our country. And, it's a multi-pronged solution. There's not really a silver bullet. If you kill, or people say like, well, why don't you just kill this one bad guy? Well, another, you cut the head off the snake, all of a sudden the snake has 5 heads. And
Right.
So, you have to be smart about the way you go about this. And it's not that I wish it were that easy to say you just, you kill 10 guys and the whole problem is over.
Right.
Like that's not, I fear it's not quite so simple as that. And
Yeah.
so, but that doesn't mean that it's one of these things you say, well, the problem's too damn complicated, we're never getting anything done. No, we have to actually get stuff done, but we have to look at it in many different perspectives and just have clear to-do lists. Frankly, I think that's why we got to work very closely with China to stop these precursor chemicals from coming here. Got to work closely with Mexico to stop the chemicals from entering their country. And then we got to work in our border to, try to control that. And frankly, we also have to work here on education in our schools and, in terms of the dangers, particularly these new kinds of drugs where you take one pill, it can kill you. It could be the first time you ever tried something.
Mm-hmm.
And, so these are very, very dangerous things. I don't think Americans necessarily know how to talk to their kids about some of these new drugs.
Right. But as always, here in the State Department, it comes back to diplomacy.
You like to think so. I mean, look, you try to work with people, right? I mean,
Yeah.
look, if you have to start dropping bombs and stuff like that, that's kind of a failure of diplomacy, right? I mean, hopefully you can work these kind of things through by talking to people and, again, identifying how their interests correspond to yours, right? I mean, that's the basis of diplomacy. If I come to you and I say, Nick, I just want you to do something, you just go ahead and do it, Nick. You're like, what the heck is that? Like, why should I do what you want me to do? Like, I'm my own guy. You're not the boss of me, right? And so I think that's often the way Americans think. Well, we'll just go to another country. We'll tell them what to do. Like that, the world doesn't
Right.
work that way. Just as our human relationships don't work that way. So, if I want you to do something, I try to think, well, what does Nick really want from me, right? How does Nick benefit from this relationship? And I say, okay, Nick really wants this. I want Nick to do that. So let's figure out a way that it's a win-win for Nick and for me. right?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what diplomacy is fundamentally about. And, going back to my childhood, I think that's one thing that I have felt blessed having grown up outside this country. I think I'm, and you also, Nick, spent some time as a kid growing up outside this country. And I think that experience gives you a little bit of sense of, seeing the world through the eyes of foreigners, not just through, the eyes of Americans. And I think that's helpful. That it's basically empathy, again, trying to think of what's in it for them. How does somebody else see the situation? Because maybe they see it differently than I do. I think if you've always grown up in the same cultural surroundings, you might not realize that not everybody shares the same assumptions around the world. I mean, we all come from, different cultures and heritages, has a big impact on the way we speak, we negotiate, we conceive things. And, for me, I feel like it's been a real blessing to have had that opportunity, to kind of see my country a little bit through a foreigner's eyes as well as through, my own American eyes.
Yeah.
I think that's helpful.
Well, on that point, I was going back and looking at your Twitter feed from when you were ambassador this morning. And it was, I think you're probably, aside from Donald Trump, the public official that is the most entertaining online.
Well, I appreciate that.
It was very fun. But I suppose my question is, like, what role do you think actually social media plays in sort of this public diplomacy? I mean, I think it's grown a lot, especially in the last couple of years, but
I think it can't be overstated. I mean, this was actually very unexpected for me. When I got to the job in Mexico, I didn't have any social media. As a lawyer, it's kind of not cool to be, I didn't think it was cool to have a social media account because, clients don't necessarily want people who are mouthing off on, all kinds of topics. Your clients have all kinds of political views, whatever. And so I kind of a lawyer, I had a very low profile. And, but when President Trump was elected in 2016, I joined Twitter just to see what he was up to. It kind of became a source of news. And when I got to Mexico, I inherited the ambassador's official account down there. So I really had no experience. My personal Twitter account had, I think, 9 followers, 8 of whom were related to me, and it was a locked and private account. But then I went out the first weekend in Mexico City to some of the markets and some of the very traditional places in the city. And I just posted pictures with my family. And I couldn't believe it, but that thing just went crazy. You could see the hearts kind of, spiraling there. I said, wow, I had, I think 50,000 likes on my first tweet as ambassador, just kind of telling people what I'd done with my family and, showing some real respect and appreciation for the local culture. I said, this is an incredibly powerful tool of communication, and then I kind of kept doing it. And I think it has to be fun and entertaining. If you just have pictures of you standing there with a foreign official shaking hands in front of the flags of your countries, okay, nobody's interested in that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's not to mean that there isn't an important substantive role, but I think you also have to show that you're a real human being. And, you have your good days, your bad days, you have a family. And, some people, again, are very private. They don't want to do that. But I thought Mexico's a very family-oriented society. I'm very proud of my family. I'm very family-oriented myself. And that's a point of commonality. So why not, talk about my family in social media? So I felt very comfortable with that and made that decision to go there. And, again, I just think it was remarkable. When I inherited that account when I arrived in Mexico City, I think it had about 20,000 followers. When I left, or within, less than 2 years, we had, more than 250,000 on that account. And again, it's not just the number of followers. It's, I think, part of being effective is you want to make, clear what the policies are, what you're doing there, what your objectives are. But also, things that show that you're a real human being, that people can relate to you, because ultimately that's what it's about. Saying, I'm a human being. This is what I'm trying to do here, and this is who I am. And I think it took people quite a long time in Mexico to actually accept the fact that I didn't have some hidden community manager who's writing my tweets.
Yeah.
And I felt actually very empowered by President Trump. I don't know if I would have done this if not for the president, because it's a very spontaneous medium. And, for every, 10 good tweets you do, there's probably going to be a clunker there somewhere that's kind of embarrassing, but that's just the nature, it's the immediacy of the medium. And I think, as I talk about this with career people here in the State Department, I think it is hard for them to be creative like that and take those risks, because I think our system of promotions and what's so in the State Department, our evaluation system, really penalizes you for something that is controversial more than it rewards you for something that is creative. So it basically incentivizes people to keep their heads down and not kind of, be edgy or push things. And it's harder as a career person to be that way.
Yeah.
But I felt I had freedom and I used it.
Yeah, that's the thing I will say is your account is overwhelmingly positive. Like it's almost always like pictures of you doing stuff with your family or funny posts about how you can't control the thermostat in your office or.
I think, but part of it is you have to take life. There's a certain sense of the absurd in all this.
Yeah.
And, I feel like I've been blessed to have a wonderful opportunity here that the president and the American people have given me to represent our country, first as ambassador to Mexico and now in this job. And I think it is interesting for people to see what life is like for a high-ranking government official. And it's kind of, peeling back the curtain in a sense and seeing, we still have our frustrations too. The copier doesn't work, or I can't set the thermostat in my office. And, you
lost your Wordle streak.
You lost my Wordle streak. I'm complaining about all kinds of stuff, right? And, I think, it's particularly in Mexico, I think less so in the States, there's kind of a mystique about public officials that they're kind of, they kind of live on Mount Olympus. And I think some people were really saying, well, this is really not dignified, Mr. Ambassador. They kind of complain about my tweets when I was going to markets and talking to people in the streets, because that's not the way people normally viewed an ambassador as behaving. They kind of thought that I'd be sitting there, just in the National Palace or in the embassy and kind of issuing dictates from on high. And I think for social media to work, I think it has to be authentic. So it doesn't work for everybody if you're not the kind of person who will just kind of let yourself be reflected in what you do. And, as a lawyer, I like to write. I really get a kick out of it. And again, I think I feel a certain sense of empowerment that the president personally tweets too. I think everybody knows, Donald Trump writes his own tweets.
He definitely does.
Thank you for your attention to this matter. And he's.
I've started adding that to my lexicon.
I love that line.
Signing off every email. Thank you for your attention to this matter!
Exclamation mark. Right. It's just But I will say this, on a more serious note about this. When my dad was ambassador, in different South American countries back in the 70s and 80s, if he wanted to get his message out to people, he had to go through the legacy media of the time, newspapers, magazines, TV, right? When you do that, you give a lot of power to somebody else. Just like in this interview, I'm giving you a lot of power, right? You are picking the questions, right? You will edit this. You will pick whatever photos accompany this. And, you can really set the tone. With social media, it creates an opportunity for our public officials to communicate directly with people. Like there is no filter. Yeah. There's no you sitting there. It's just me talking directly to people. And of course, they can ignore me if they want, or, but they can also interact. And I think that's really cool too, for me as a public official to see direct feedback from people. And, there's haters out there. You have to have kind of a thick skin because somebody's going to tell you, you're ugly or you're, blah, 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 any insult they can come up with. But, at some point, you just blow that off, say, look, this person's never met me. I have a wonderful family. I have friends. I don't really care about the opinion of somebody I've never met. I mean, I don't care about it if they're insulting to me, but if they're saying something substantive, I think that's very valuable for people to have. I actually try to read my feedback. In Mexico, I found it very helpful to find out what are Mexicans actually interested in, and not just the political class of leaders that I might meet in my ordinary duties as ambassador, but people across the country in a wide range of occupations, men, women, everything, and I think it is useful for our public officials. It's a very democratizing kind of medium because you can have direct contact. I mean, somebody you would never meet in real life, you can talk to and they'll tell you, this is what interests me. This is what bothers me.
Yeah. Well, I think I probably should ask you some serious questions about what you've been doing as Deputy Secretary of State. You recently made a visit to Mexico, and you've in a couple other countries as well. You've announced some sanctions on some of these drug cartels. Tell us a little bit about that, how all that came together.
Yeah. So, one of the things that again, I'm very thankful to the president, to Secretary Rubio for putting me in this job, giving me this opportunity to serve again. Both Secretary Rubio and I have long been very focused on the Western Hemisphere. And I think it is great that we really have a chance now to question a lot of traditional assumptions about the U.S. post-war foreign policy world that frankly has given the Western Hemisphere very, very short shrift in our policy considerations. I mean, none of the, most of the big think tanks around town have only a token Latin American program, if any. But in a sense, Latin America, as you know, Nick, probably has a more direct impact on our country, particularly Mexico, than almost any other country in terms of migration, crime, drugs, but also economics. Mexico is now our largest trading partner. A lot of people don't recognize or appreciate that. And more Americans go to Mexico, frankly, than any other country in the world. There's a huge consular relationship. I mean, I think 38 million Americans go to Mexico every year. My sense is the next is maybe Canada with 8 million or something, but it's by about a factor of 5 or so in my recollection.
It's like almost 10% of the American population
goes
every year
to Mexico, right? And so, again, you can only imagine as ambassador, I had every issue under the sun, from Americans getting arrested, from, dying, all kinds of stuff would happen. And so, it's just, that gave me a sense of what goes on in the State Department. Going back to my recent trip, I mean, we're obviously in very close, consultation with the Mexican government to try to work out a plan where, we work together to combat these drug cartels, which pose such a risk to both countries. And so, I wanted my first foreign trip in this job to be to Latin America, particularly to Mexico, just again to show the importance of the region. So I went to Mexico, then I went to El Salvador and Guatemala, again, to highlight how we're looking at these international relationships in new and fresh ways. I think traditionally, the first visit of Secretary Rubio, also his first visit was to some of these same countries in Central America and the Caribbean, because he is sending this message too. Whereas I think most of our predecessors' first visit would have been to Europe or Japan, the Far East somewhere, or the Middle East. I think, I personally would like, a legacy of mine here, and I've only been here 2 months, so talking about legacies is a little bit preposterous at this point, but to be hopefully engaging with some of the more forgotten parts of the world where, that the U.S.'s foreign policy establishment has overlooked. Latin America, Africa, the Stans, Southeast Asia. Let's kind of engage with some of these places where, we just haven't been as active for a long time, and see, what can we do to, get some benefits out of these areas. But go back to Mexico, I think, I think we need to send a message to the Mexicans that the status quo is unacceptable with, dangerous cartel activity at and sometimes crossing our southern border. The cartels were very active during the last administration in particular. The migrant traffic brought huge amounts of monies into their coffers. That has dried up almost overnight. And again, Nick, I want to just stop a second and say how incredible it is. All these people in the last administration saying, oh no, we need legislation. We can't solve this migrant problem, blah, blah. Donald Trump came in. I think illegal border crossings to our southern border are down 99.99% in the first couple of months, which just underscores this is all about the incentive structure you put in place. People are not going to risk their lives and their fortunes to undertake this dangerous journey to come into our country illegally if they don't think they're going to be allowed in if they get to the border, and allowed to stay here if they are allowed in, right? And so if we send the wrong messages and we create the wrong incentives, we're just it's creating our own problem. As soon as those incentives are gone, the problem almost vanishes by itself. I mean, frankly, our bigger problem now is how to repatriate the millions of people that were let in illegally during the last administration.
Right.
That's going to be a big challenge for us.
Yeah.
But obviously in Mexico, the security challenges with the cartels are a major challenge. We declared them foreign terrorist organizations to enhance some of our authorities to deal with them. But I want the American people should know that this is a very high priority for the Trump administration. And the Mexicans should know that we are not messing around, that we're not going to, take mañana for an answer on some of these issues, but we're going to expect results. But we also have to show to the Mexicans that we're not just asking them to solve our problem, that we are also taking some serious steps in our own country to address these problems. And I think, that way we can, that's the way you try to solve these things.
Yeah. Well, you guys have also taken a big role on the legal migration stuff as well, between the travel bans and some of the student visa stuff. What does this actually look like on the ground? Say if you're trying to come in, get your visa from one of these countries.
Look, again, I think a lot of these issues have not been looked at in a long time. I think in the last few years, we have seen, some really disturbing images from our college campuses with some of our Jewish students not able to attend class because they're being harassed by anti-Israel protesters. And that is totally unacceptable, as the administration has made clear, in the United States of America. But to our horror, we discovered that a lot of these are foreign students who are here on visa in our country. So we're giving student visa, which is a privilege the United States hands out. Nobody has a right to come and study in our country.
Right.
But we're handing out to people who actually are here trashing our values and intimidating other students. And let's be clear. I mean, people, once they're here, they have a right to express their views and protest peacefully if they think necessary. But we don't have to invite those people in if they are coming for the purpose of being activists and not actually studying here.
Yeah.
And I just think for a long time, we've had kind of a messed up approach to foreign student visas, which is kind of the more the merrier approach. The more foreign students we have studying in our schools, that is somehow good for the United States. I think we just need to re-examine some of these assumptions. Frankly, as somebody who has college-age kids, let me tell you, the percentage of the student body in a lot of our colleges, universities has gone up astronomically since I was a kid. When I was in college, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2% of my college class were foreign students here on visas. Now in a lot of schools, it's 25, 30%. And, coming from some of the countries in the world that are not even our friends. And then we need to look like how many of these kids who are coming here on visas are staying here for good. Is that what we want in our country? I mean, are they going back, becoming leaders in their country? Are they coming here and engaging in again, activism as opposed to studies? I think in this area, as many others, the system has just been running on autopilot for a long time with nobody actually minding the store. And I think it's just important, and the President and Secretary Rubio have been very clear on this. Let's just make sure that our student visa programs, like everything else that we are giving out, are actually advancing the interests of the United States of America. And I think this is an important national conversation we should have. What is the appropriate number of foreign students? Why do we have foreign students here in the first place? What is the benefit for the country? I think there are answers to some of these questions, but I'm saying this is a conversation I think it is long overdue to have, because, depending on the answers to those questions, we should be certainly modulating, how many students come in and from what countries.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I know you got to run to another important meeting here, but thank you so much for your time. Where can people keep up with your legendary X account, all the other fun things that you're doing over here at the State Department?
Well, thank you, Nick. And I can't believe an hour has gone by already.
I know.
And this has been a lot of fun. Maybe if your listeners like this, we could do a second hour about some more substance. I didn't even get to some of my broader issues on U.S. foreign policy generally, in the way that our traditional foreign policy establishment, I think, has kind of lost the thread after the Cold War of what is the point of U.S. foreign policy now? What about, all our involvements in the world, and lost sight of George Washington's very wise admonition against foreign entanglements. And there's a lot to talk about here.
I'd love to do that. Part 2.
Okay, part 2.
We'll do it.
I would like to do it too, because again, I think there's, one of the problems, I think, is that our foreign policy establishment has become very isolated from the American people. I think people deserve to know what we're thinking about, those of us who are blessed to be here in some positions of authority, what the way we're thinking and why we're doing certain things. So I feel that part of my job is to do stuff like this, to talk to you and the American people about my views. And, people are free to disagree with me. People can write comments saying, you're trash, whatever. Like that's okay with me. That's our robust the debate system. But anyway, so, I appreciate this time to introduce myself to the American people and to your listeners. You can follow me on Twitter. Deputy Sex State is my official account. Chris Landau USA is my personal.
That's where
account.
The real fun happens.
Well, whatever. You said it, not me. I'm not, anyway, so thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for another fantastic episode of Moment of Truth. And thank you to Deputy Secretary Landau and his team for hosting us over here at the State Department. It was a super fascinating conversation. We had a great time. Please rate and review the podcast. 5 stars only, please. Always feel free to suggest other cool guests that we could have on in the future. Got to plug the website one more time at AmericanMoment.org. Our team put so much hard work into it, and we put a lot of hard work into putting programs on too, so make sure to check those out. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.